At the board meeting, my father mocked me for not being smart enough to run the business, so I made him beg for mercy with my masterful takedown. The boardroom was colder than usual, not because of the temperature, but because of the atmosphere my father had carefully cultivated over decades, one of command, dominance, and silent fear. The long mahogany table gleamed under the lights, perfectly polished like the illusion of control he still clung to. He sat at the head, flanked by men and women who had nodded at every directive he barked, their loyalty carved from fear, not respect. I'd sat here too many times, ignored, spoken over, treated like a placeholder instead of an heir. And today, he was ready to humiliate me again, only this time. He did it openly, arrogantly. "Let's not waste time pretending," he said, folding his hands and leaning back with that same smirk that used to make my stomach churn when I was younger. "He's not ready. He never will be." The boardroom chuckled lightly, some nervously, some genuinely. My father thrived on that, the performance, the dominance, the staged defeat of his own son in front of his empire. But he had no idea what was coming. For years, I'd sat through those meetings, watched how he moved, listened to every decision he made, both wise and reckless. I said little, not because I lacked thoughts, but because I was building something far more important than presence. I was building leverage. While he enjoyed the power, I was studying the machine, learning every bolt and flaw. And over the past 18 months, I rewrote the future of the company without him even noticing. I didn't need to yell or argue. I stood up calmly. My fingers didn't shake. My breath stayed steady. "I'm calling for a leadership vote," I said, and even those who had already agreed to support me blinked in surprise. My father straightened up, suddenly losing the comfort in his posture. "That's not how this works," he said, narrowing his eyes. "It is," I replied, pulling out the binder that had been waiting in my briefcase. I dropped it on the table with a sound that silenced the room. Section 9.4, Company Charter. A leadership vote can be triggered if a board member submits evidence of gross mismanagement and secures a quorum. I've done both. I turned to the screen as my assistant clicked through the presentation. It wasn't flashy. I didn't need drama. Just truth, sharp, documented, undeniable. Slide by slide, I broke down the recent numbers. Declining profits traced back to personal choices he'd forced through without consultation. 3 major deals we lost because he refused to adapt to changing markets. Internal memos that showed staff turnover linked to his aggressive leadership style. Hidden liabilities, some buried, some disguised, all carrying his signature. By the time I was done, no one was laughing. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked relieved. I ended with a breakdown of my plan. A new approach. Strategic realignments already in motion with 3 of our partners, who had quietly agreed to re-engage, but only if my father was no longer at the helm. Contracts had been redrafted. Alliances quietly restructured. I had taken his network and rebuilt it under my vision. Then came the vote. No hesitation. 1 hand. Then another. And another. All 11 members in complete agreement. I watched him closely as the room fell quiet again. The way his face seemed to drain of color, but his pride kept him upright. He didn't speak. Not until everyone else looked away, giving us a brief moment of isolation in the crowded room. Finally, he rose, unsure of what to do. His voice, once the loudest in any room, barely carried. "What do you want from me?" I walked toward him, no anger, just precision in my tone. "Exactly what you gave me all these years, a seat at the table." But no voice. He stared at me, speechless. There was no room for yelling, no chance for bargaining. I had used his own system, his own documents, his own pride to take everything he denied me. The room emptied slowly after the vote, no one wanting to be the last to leave, yet no one daring to speak to my father either. They walked out in a line of silence, some giving me nods they would have never dared to before, others pretending they hadn't just watched the empire shift hands in a single meeting. I didn't bother acknowledging them. They weren't my concern now. My attention stayed on the man who had sat at the top for 41 years and now stood quietly, like a statue in a place that no longer belonged to him. He didn't say another word. He turned and walked out, his back stiff, movements rigid, not in pain, but in disbelief. This wasn't just a change of leadership. It was a fracture in his identity. He hadn't just lost power. He'd been removed, dissected, and rendered obsolete. And I didn't give him the luxury of privacy. I let every board member see what defeat looked like when it came from inside your own bloodline. Once he was gone, I stayed behind. The documents needed signatures. My assistant, Kara, laid out the paperwork without needing instructions. She had been with me from the beginning of this plan. She didn't ask if I was sure. We'd passed that point months ago. With every signature I laid down, the weight of what just happened pressed down harder, not as fear, but as clarity. There was no undoing this. No clean path backward. I hadn't won a battle. I'd rewritten a legacy. That night, I didn't go home. I went straight to the executive floor, to the office he'd once ruled from. Security had already been informed. His clearance was revoked. The locks had been changed. No farewell speech. No transition period. I took the key card, swiped the reader, and walked in. It smelled like old leather and worn-out pride. His chair still faced the city skyline, just like it had every morning since I was in middle school. The desk was clean, almost surgically so, like the man who sat here never believed chaos could touch him. I didn't sit down immediately. I walked around the room, every detail still echoing his presence, the framed awards, the newspaper clippings, the black and white photo of him and the company's first client. It wasn't nostalgia. It was data, evidence of who he had been and why he had failed to keep up. I sat down and opened the top drawer. Inside was a letter opener, an old pen set, and a flash drive labeled simply with his initials. It wasn't encrypted. He never believed anyone had the nerve to go through his things. I plugged it into the desktop. Folders opened without resistance. Years of private notes, audio memos, legal reviews, much of it outdated, but buried in the mess was a voice file titled Contingency. I clicked play. His voice crackled through the speakers, slower, colder than I'd expected. If you're hearing this, then I was outmaneuvered. Not removed by outsiders, but by someone within. My guess? My son. He paused. If that's true, then he learned well. Maybe too well. I always knew he was watching. I didn't flinch. I let the recording play through. I left him out of key decisions because I didn't believe he could carry the weight. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because he didn't have the edge. Turns out I was wrong. And if he's hearing this now, then he found the edge I thought he'd never grow. It ended without sentiment. No apology. No regrets. Just an acknowledgement. He knew I'd come for the throne, and part of him had waited for it. I deleted the file without saving it. I didn't need proof of his approval. I didn't do this for that. By morning, a company-wide statement was ready. Kara helped draft it, direct and unambiguous. The message went out before sunrise. The founder had stepped down due to strategic misalignment with current goals. Effective immediately, the leadership transition was complete. No room for rumors. No soft wording to preserve his image. The wording had been chosen carefully, as cold and clean as the vote itself. Most employees didn't react publicly. Some messaged their supervisors. Others just went about their day. The executive team, those still loyal to the founder, scheduled private meetings with me. I kept them short. I didn't owe them a discussion about what happened. The transition had happened within the bylaws. It wasn't betrayal. It was execution of governance. 3 of them handed in their resignations. I accepted them without comment. They weren't part of the new structure. Loyalty to him meant blindness to growth. I needed minds that weren't rooted in the past. At noon, my father called. I didn't answer. At 2, he texted. One word, lunch. I stared at it for exactly 4 seconds, then replied, 3 p.m. Westport Grill. Private room. When I arrived, he was already seated, wearing the same gray suit he always wore to deal-making lunches. His tie was tighter than usual. Not a sign of pride, but of formality, like he needed the fabric around his throat to remind himself who he used to be. You look taller, he said as I sat across from him. I've been standing up straighter, I answered. He didn't smile. You embarrass me, he said. Not angry. Not accusatory. Just matter of fact. You gave me no choice. I gave you a seat at the table, but not a voice, not influence, not access, just a chair to keep warm. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. You think you've won something permanent, but this isn't chess. Business shifts. People shift. The moment you slip, even slightly, they'll come for you like you came for me. I didn't blink. Then I'll make sure I don't slip. For a few seconds, the air between us felt familiar. Like the years I spent trying to prove myself were still sitting in the room, watching us both. But then it passed. There was no more hierarchy here. Just two men who had played the same game at different times, and only one had played it better. He reached into his coat pocket and slid a folder across the table. You're going to need these, he said. Legal records. Vendor disputes. Files only I had access to. I opened it. There were documents inside that would save me weeks of investigation. Quiet lawsuits. Settlements. Shadow accounts used for managing tax repositioning strategies. Useful, yes. Dangerous if left hidden, definitely. Why give me this? I asked. Because no one else knows about them. And if you fumble, it's not just your name that burns. It's mine. I built the company. Whether I run it or not, my name's still on the door. I stared at the folder. He was right. A fall under my leadership wouldn't just erase me. It would tarnish everything he had spent 4 decades creating. I won't let it burn, I said, closing the file. He nodded, but not like he believed me. More like he understood that whether I did or didn't, it was no longer his choice. We didn't talk much after that. I paid the bill. As I stood up, he looked at me one last time. You're not me, he said. I know, I answered. That's why this will work. The next morning, I made the first public-facing decision of my tenure. We dissolved 3 legacy divisions that had been draining resources for years, kept afloat only because of his personal attachment to them. I restructured leadership under a flatter model. No more hierarchy for the sake of ego. Each senior leader reported directly to me, no more filters. I met with our largest partners by the end of the week and laid out the future. No promises. No sweeping speeches. Just performance goals, restructuring deadlines, and growth projections that didn't rely on fading reputation. Some were hesitant, others intrigued, but none refused. Internally, changes rippled. The younger managers responded quickly, energized by the shift. Older ones tried to find their footing. Not all of them would last. That was inevitable. But the fear that had once ruled the halls began to disappear. Not replaced by celebration, just by awareness. Things had changed, and the new system demanded results, not legacy. By the end of that first month, we landed 2 major contracts previously lost under his leadership. One came from a tech firm that had refused to work with us because of his outdated methods. They returned after we reopened talks with a more adaptive proposal. The other was a manufacturing deal restructured through new logistics I had proposed last year, which he had rejected without reading. He saw the headlines. He sent no message. I didn't expect him to. I didn't need validation anymore. He had built the company brick by brick. I had turned it into something he never could, a structure that wasn't just tall, but fluid, expandable, resilient. He built an empire. I built a future. And I hadn't even started the real transformation yet. 3 months after the takeover, the company had become unrecognizable to those who clung to the past. It didn't run on hierarchy anymore. It moved on function, results, and precision. The old culture, built on intimidation and tradition, was replaced by sharp operations and fluid systems. No longer did people lower their voices when the CEO passed through the halls. They looked up, not with fear, with acknowledgement. The board met again. This time, I sat at the head of the table without resistance. No one questioned the seat. No smirks. No side glances. Reports were delivered efficiently. Our numbers were climbing. Departments that had been stagnant for years showed signs of life. For the first time in a decade, turnover dropped. One board member who had been loyal to my father leaned in after the meeting and said, "We should have done this years ago." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Outside the building, our name was showing up in conversations we'd been excluded from for too long. Media began to notice. Not with flattery, but with curiosity. They wanted to understand how the same company that had plateaued under my father's rule was suddenly gaining traction across industries. Analysts called it bold leadership. Insiders knew it was calculated restructuring. Either way, I didn't chase headlines. The work spoke for itself. But legacy doesn't vanish quietly. About 6 weeks after our public rebranding campaign, a former executive, one of my father's last silent loyalists, leaked confidential materials to a competitor. The data wasn't current, but it was enough to suggest instability. Stock prices took a minor hit. Whispers about my leadership surfaced. For 2 days, internal communication slowed, waiting for a reaction. I didn't panic. I called a meeting with legal, finance, and public relations. We traced the leak, identified the source, and gathered evidence within hours. By the next day, the individual was terminated, the breach disclosed legally, and our statement was released. No over-explanation, just a clear confirmation of the breach, a summary of our action, and a reaffirmation of data security protocols. Within a week, the stock rebounded. Internally, the response wasn't silence. It was confidence. The team saw how we handled the first real threat, not with fear, but with control. Later that month, I visited the branch in Chicago, one of the oldest locations, long neglected under my father's centralized control model. Managers had been operating on outdated policies for years. I walked in without announcement, met directly with staff, reviewed operations myself, and by the end of the day, I laid out a plan to streamline every division there. Not a proposal, an action. Within 48 hours, new systems were implemented. Redundant roles were reassigned, not eliminated. Productivity climbed by 20% in the first month. Headquarters took notice. Back home, my father had kept a distance. He hadn't returned to the building since the vote. We hadn't spoken again. But then, 2 months after the breach incident, I received a formal invitation, a private business roundtable hosted by several retired CEOs in the city. My name was listed alongside industry giants. One of the guests? My father. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. The venue was discreet, an old university building turned private hall. No press, no audience, just men and women who had ruled their industries and now gathered to observe the next wave. I arrived on time. My father was already seated near the center, quietly talking to another retired executive. He saw me, but didn't react. The moderator opened the discussion with market shifts and leadership adaptation. Each guest shared their observations, most with generic remarks about evolution, risk, and innovation. I listened, measured. Then the question came, given the rapid change in your organization, how did you execute transformation without internal collapse? I answered plainly, by refusing to protect the past. Legacy can be honored, but not preserved at the cost of relevance. We dismantled everything that no longer served the company. No ceremony, just assessment, action, and accountability. There was no applause, just a pause. A weight in the air as the message landed. The moderator nodded. And what do you believe is the single failure most companies make during transition? I didn't hesitate, waiting for permission. Across the table, my father shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to show he was listening differently now. The discussion continued, but the room had tilted. The oldest voice had been replaced by the one they once ignored. Afterward, as people left, he approached. His tone wasn't cold. It was steady. You said what needed to be said, he told me. I didn't say it for you. I know. That's why it worked. He held out his hand, not as a gesture of defeat, as recognition. I shook it. We didn't exchange more words. We didn't need to. There was nothing left to argue. The company had moved on. So had we. In the months that followed, we entered new sectors, ones my father had dismissed as distractions. We took calculated risks, and most of them paid off. Revenue didn't just rise. Our structure grew leaner, sharper. Competitors who once ignored us began watching closely. Internally, the leadership team transformed. Titles shifted. Younger voices took charge of key projects. I built a second line of decision-makers trained to think like builders, not followers. We weren't just maintaining momentum. We were creating it. By the end of the fiscal year, we closed it with our highest growth since the company's founding. At the final board meeting of the year, I stood again at the head of the table. There was no need to defend my position. No presentation designed to prove anything. I gave a concise update, shared future objectives, and invited direct feedback. The room was engaged, not intimidated. And when I ended the meeting, every person stood, not out of obligation, but because they knew the era had changed for good. That evening, I walked through the building one more time, not to reflect, but to observe. Staff worked with focus, not fear. Meetings ran on time. There was energy, not tension. I took the elevator to the executive floor. The old office, once my father's domain, remained in use, but I'd modified it. Gone were the walls of outdated awards. In their place, whiteboards, interactive panels, live performance metrics. Not for display, for decisions. I sat down at the desk, just for a moment. Not because I needed to feel something, but to mark something complete. My father had once told me I wasn't sharp enough to lead, that I didn't have the edge. He was wrong. I wasn't born to follow his legacy. I was born to surpass it.